Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Murderers, rapists, and kidnappers often choose to shift blame away from themselves, pointing the finger at some kind of traumatic event that changed the course of their lives and made them turn towards crime. Detectives and criminal psychologists also examine the upbringing and history of killers, searching for anything that might have acted as a turning point. Molestation, abandonment, violence. But for one serial killer, his turning point was a little more unusual. The childhood kidnapping of his own younger brother. Cary Stayner had 3 sisters, but only one brother, Stephen, who was 4 years younger than Cary. When Stephen was 7 years old, he disappeared. Although his family had no idea what happened to him, Stephen was being held captive less than 40 miles away, kept in the house of the man who abducted him, a pedophile by the name of Kenneth Parnell. By the time 7 years had passed, the chances of Stephen still being alive were slim to none. Even before Stephen went missing, Cary had not been like the other kids. He'd always been anxious, developing trichotillomania as a toddler, which made him pull out his own hair. Despite medication, he continued to compulsively pluck the hair from his scalp, causing bald spots that the other kids made fun of him for. Later, he reported having dark sexual fantasies from a very young age, imagining kidnapping, raping, and killing women even before his own brother became the victim of the same kind of criminal. Stephen's abduction became the center of Cary's teenage years. While his parents grieved Stephen, their older son felt neglected and pushed aside. He was shockingly intelligent and creative, but none of his academic pursuits satisfied him. His dark fantasies got stronger and stronger in his teenage years, and he eventually acted on them by exposing his genitals to a friend of his sister's. Then, essentially a miracle took place. Stephen Stayner, who was now a teenager, managed to escape captivity alongside Timothy White, another kidnapped boy. He was an instant celebrity, even featuring in a TV series called I Know My First Name is Stephen. Cary felt like his family's forgotten child, the son that they didn't pay attention to. After his graduation, Cary had gotten a job working at a glass company. He later said that while he was at work installing windows, he constantly fantasized about killing all of his coworkers by crashing a truck into his workplace and then lighting it on fire. During this time, tragedy struck the Stayner family again. After surviving 7 years of sexual abuse and captivity, Stephen was in a fatal motorcycle crash. He'd only lived for 10 years after his escape. In his early 30s, Cary tried to kill himself with carbon monoxide poisoning, but his suicide attempt failed. 4 years later, he spent time in a mental health facility after having a breakdown, but after his symptoms got better, he was discharged. Cary tried to self-medicate, using drugs to distract himself. All they did was make him more and more unstable. In 1997, Cary started work as a general handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel, close to one of the entrances to Yosemite National Park. The lodge soon became a hunting ground, full of the kind of prey that he'd always fantasized about catching. Over a 6-month period in 1999, 4 people connected to the motel were violently killed. In February 1999, Carol Yvonne Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie Sund, and a 16-year-old exchange student Silvina Peloso were staying at Cedar Lodge and went missing. 2 of the bodies, Carol's and Silvina's, were found almost a month later, crammed into the trunk of Carol's rental car. The car had been set on fire, and Carol and Silvina's charred remains needed to be identified with dental records. Even with the degree of damage the fire had caused to the bodies, the autopsy found that Silvina had been raped, while Carol had been strangled. Both victims had also been shot. 1 week after the 2 bodies were located, somebody sent a note to the local police reading, quote, "We had fun with this one," with a sketch of a map drawn underneath. At the location indicated by the map, police found Julie's body. She had been sexually assaulted before having her throat cut. Police carried out interviews of all the employees at the motel, but they didn't view Cary as a suspect. 4 months later, a headless body was found in the same area, and later identified as 26-year-old Joey Ruth Armstrong, a naturalist who worked for the Yosemite Institute. Unlike the previous 3 victims, Joey had only been killed the previous day, making it easier for investigators to follow the trail of the killer. Eyewitnesses had seen Cary's vehicle parked outside Joey's cabin the day before her body was found, but he was nowhere to be seen. The FBI was involved and tracked Cary to a nudist resort where he was staying and arrested him on suspicion of murder. During questioning, Cary made an unusual choice. He immediately confessed to killing Joey, but told investigators that he had also murdered Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and he had been the one to send the map of where Julie's body could be found. Now, investigators had a man in custody who'd openly admitted to 4 violent crimes. It would be highly unusual for a man this violent and sadistic to only have started killing in his late 30s, and detectives began to examine other cases that Cary could have been involved in when he was younger. Once they started looking, the clues were everywhere. In 1981, a young woman named Patricia Dahlstrom had testified against a cult leader, Donald Gibson, who had sexually assaulted her. Donald was an acquaintance of Cary. Cary even went to his trial to support the man. 2 years later, Patricia went missing in Yosemite National Park, and her skeletal remains were found the following year. Had Cary murdered Patricia as revenge for testifying against his friend? It definitely looks that way. Another cold case. In 1994, 2 severed hands were found in the Sierra Nevada foothills, followed by a decapitated, handless body 2 months later. The following year, the remains were positively identified as a 24-year-old woman named Sherilyn Murphy. Her killer was never identified, and to this day, despite extensive searching, her missing head has not been found. Was it possible that Cary also murdered male victims? Investigators considered the possibility that he'd been also responsible for the disappearance of 20-year-old Michael Madden, who'd gone missing on his way to California's Stanislaus National Forest. Yosemite National Park, where Cary seemed to commit all of his crimes, was only 75 miles away from there. There was also one potential victim who was closer to home, Cary's uncle, Jesse Stayner, who had been shot to death in 1990. The murder weapon was Jesse's own gun, and the killer was never found. Later, Cary claimed that his uncle had molested him when he was a little boy. Although he was never found guilty of killing his uncle, he had a connection with the victim, as well as a possible motive for killing him. Because Joey Armstrong had been killed on federal land, Cary went to trial in federal court. Desperate to avoid a death sentence, he decided to plead guilty to all the charges against him, a hefty list of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated sexual abuse that had resulted in death. Despite seemingly completely unbothered, even proud during his confession, he showed a completely different reaction during his sentencing. In front of the court, Cary began sobbing, saying, quote, "I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry. I wish there was a reason, but there isn't. It's senseless." Cary avoided a death sentence, instead being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In state court, facing charges for another 3 murders, Cary changed his tactic and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. While a doctor testified that Cary had autism, OCD, and abnormal sexual desires, as well as a potential history of sexual abuse, Cary was found to be sane. He was found guilty of first-degree murder of all 3 victims, as well as the kidnapping of one victim he'd removed from the scene. For these charges, Cary was sentenced to death in 2002. Since then, Cary has been imprisoned on death row at California's San Quentin State Prison, but nobody has been executed in California since 2006. The Stayner family lost their 2 boys, one a victim and one a perpetrator. Somehow, Cary lived through the experience of his brother being abducted by a monster and then grew up to be a monster himself. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for listening today. And a group that I know is listening that I really appreciate is the Hammond Fire Station, Engine 72 out in California. They're OG supporters of 10-Minute Murder, especially Mr. Alvarez there. He suggested this story today that I did, along with one a while back that I covered, Marcus Wesson, which was extremely interesting to research and very disturbing. One of the most difficult ones to cover that I've ever done. If you haven't listened to that one, go back. It's a very good one. So thanks to you all for what you're doing. I know it's a difficult job, so stay safe. Hey, if this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all the back episodes, never miss any of the new ones. Connect with me on social media, see the visuals that we're talking about here in the podcast. Nothing gross and graphic. I wouldn't do that to you. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review on Apple or any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is appreciated. And if you're thinking, maybe I'd like to send Joe a message or email, you can. You can DM me on social media, slide into my DMs, but not like that, but you know what I mean. That's less reliable though, because you know how it goes on social media. You get bots and stuff. I don't know who's real and who's fake. And then just the volume of them that I get, I read them all, but it's hard to respond to all of them. So the easiest way to make sure my eyeballs get to your message is email joe@10minutemurder.com. And that's it. Thanks for listening today. Or if you're on to the next episode, talk to you again soon.